I first heard of Therizinosaurus vaguely around 2010, registering that it was an oddball theropod with massive claws and returned to herbivory. It wasn't until 𝗣𝗍𝗱𝗁𝗍𝗄 surfaced around 2014 that I got more interested in Therizinosaurus as well, since they have so many similarities. When I reviewed the latest PNSO, the excellent 𝗣𝗍𝗱𝗁𝗍𝗄, I hoped for a Therizinosaurus, and amazingly enough, that's the very next one that PNSO has given us. Therizinosaurus has recently become better known thanks to Jurassic World Dominion. And very recently, we had the GR Toys release of their version. And while Therizinosaurus lent its name to its clade, it is itself very fragmentary. The entire animal is a composite of parts from better known relatives such as Erlikosaurus, Sagnosaurus, 𝗭𝘢𝘳𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 usually looks like this. And this is 𝗔𝗱𝗱𝗃𝗃 the Therizinosaurus. Therizinosaurus is estimated to be 4 to 5 meters or 13 to 16 feet tall. 𝗔𝗱𝗃𝗃 is 15 centimeters or 5.9 inches tall, making it about 1 to 33 scale. However, measuring an imaginary line through the centra gives us about 26 centimeters or 10.3 inches. Based on an estimate of 9 meters or 29.5 feet gives us 1 to 35 scale. And here's how small it looked next to it. First, let's talk the overall color. Coming right after the vividly painted 𝗣𝗚𝗃𝗃𝗃, the release image struck me as rather plain. Now, of course, that is realistic for a large animal. However, like the Sinraptor, it's actually a very nice scheme, with subtleties you'll appreciate when you have it in hand. For example, this very nice fade from the dark brown to rust orange, then into a paler orange. Then here in the neck, you see how naturally this boundary is done. Throughout the body, you'll see contrasting colors. Also in the arms, the legs, and from dorsal to ventral. And here from the top, you see at once that far from being a plain dinosaur, there are some beautifully executed fades here, here, and here. Then down in the tail, you get this horizontal banding effect across 3 colors. So there is still plenty of color in this, and the paint application, while subdued compared to 𝗣𝗚𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, is still very pleasing. And now the head. And since the heads are known, PNSO has modeled this on the skull of Erlikosaurus, which has the most complete skull of all therizinosaurids found so far. Our details include the small, carefully painted eyes, the keratinous remphatheca, and the downturned jaws. I like the green around the eyes, worked into the rather complementary color of the pink. The jaw articulates, and though that's a feature possibly more meaningful in a carnivore, it does help you see the form of the downturned mandible more easily. The inside detail is really nice as well. Sadly, it also shows the discontinuity here, which might offend your sense of design fluidity. Particularly this projection here. And for all its good points in terms of coloration, I'm extremely puzzled by the sharp demarcation between the dark and the light here in the jaw. Other than that, the integument is as usual for PNSO, that is to say meticulously sculpted. Moving down the neck, you'll start seeing a lot more of that downy integument. The anterior neck is kept relatively bare, just like the 𝗣𝗚𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, on the theory that this is where the animal would lose heat. The colors are blended really beautifully here. Down here in the back, can just see the wonderful flow of the fur. Just look at these textures. Just really loving the separate lines of flow here. And down the arms, and I'm really sounding like a broken record here when I say just how pleasing this blend is. Therizinosaurus means scythe lizard. Of course, those oversized claws are a draw for this dinosaur. The color fade is really good, with so many subtleties as you can see, and even more you'll see when you have it in hand. The shape generally looks good, capturing the overlong and relatively straight claws. Now I wish the claws were not quite so orangey and had a bit more of an ivory white to it. The dorsal view suggests the extremely compressed thinness of the underlying ungual. Now moving down, PNSO has also taken care to keep the pelvis broad and present that characteristic vat-like gut. Then the hind limbs, with its relatively short and robust thighs. Really love the transition of colors here, especially down in the leg, into the black-brown here, which continues into the nails. Much better than just abrupt full black claws you often see. Then down to the toes, and I'm really delighted that there are 4 weight-bearing toes. Now this is an error that GR Toys made. Proportion-wise, I think PNSO has captured the relative lengths very well. Digits 2 and 4 are almost the same length, digit 3 a little longer, and digit 1 shorter. PNSO really does its research, I'm happy to see. And to be honest, this is the very first thing I checked, and PNSO did not disappoint. Unfortunately, it is digitigrade, and we'll talk more about this later. Then the tail to finish things off. The tail is kept simple after 𝗣𝗱𝗁𝗱𝗄𝗧. But I really like the way that these feathers drape over here. And from the ventral side, you see this impinging. And to cap it all off, just look at the tattering on the edge here, very naturalistic. And speaking of which, let's track back up here, where you see just how naturally the boundary of the feathers drapes over the skin, without giving it that hair shirt look. Now thankfully the pose is very natural, in mid-stride with the arms in a somewhat of a resting position, instead of some of those exaggerated poses you often see. Stands quite well on its own, but as always, you must use a support as warping often occurs in bipedal models. And now for a bit of science, and surprisingly, we're not going straight for those massive claws, but rather the other end, the feet. And that's possibly the least sexy part you can think of when it comes to dinosaurs, but for foot fetishists, this might prove tasty. A very distinct feature of theropods are their bird-like feet. Many arguments have been raised about how bird-like they really should be. For example, did they actually have tarsal scutes? That aside, now some points are beyond contestation. The typical theropod foot is an obligatory digitigrade one, with tridactyl weight bearing on 3 toes, 2, 3, and 4. Many mammals, including ourselves, are plantigrade, and here's our foot. These are our digits, the toes, consisting of the phalanges. Our foot bones, the metatarsals, then the tarsals, the ankle bones. We walk on our soles, called the plantar surface here, and if you have plantar fasciitis, you definitely are aware of it every step. Digitigrade means walking on your digits with the metatarsals raised and essentially becoming another segment of the hind limbs. That's also why some animals look like they're double-jointed, because of this extra joint here. This joint is in fact what in us would be the ankle joint. The extreme case of unguligrade locomotion happens when only the tips of the distal phalanx contacts the ground, as seen in horses or in a ballerina on pointe. You'll notice that in the case of digitigrade locomotion, the intermediate phalanges also take part in weight bearing. Now, this is the kind of locomotion seen in most theropods. Now, Therizinosaurs are unusual theropods. Many large herbivores generally become obligate quadrupeds, since the large gut tends to shift their CG forward. But Therizinosaurs, while turning to herbivory, retain bipedalism, with a few adaptations that allow them to stay upright. And one of them is plantigrade. Now first, if you've never heard of 𝗣𝗱𝗱𝗏𝗂𝗄𝑠auros, Macropodosaurus, and 𝗣𝗱𝗱𝗏𝗂𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 all, but ichnofossils. When we say fossils, we immediately think of bones and skeletons, but I'm sure you've also heard of trace fossils. Ichnofossils are just a cooler name for trace fossils. Now, these are traces of animal activity, but not the animal itself. So, included are trackways, footprints, burrows, and scatological material. So, a paleontologist might not always mean that a recent dinosaur find was fragmentary when he says that it was shit. Each distinctive ichthyofossil is given a name. Macropodosaurus gravis is such a name, given to a trackway of footprints from the late Cretaceous Tajikistan. Zakharov in 1964 recognized that it differed from other typical theropod tracks, suggesting a massive, bipedal, plantigrade, and slow-moving dinosaur with a short stride. He surmised that as such, this theropod was likely not a fast-moving carnivore, but perhaps an omnivore. He concluded that there could as yet be unknown dinosaurs that diverged from other theropods, and as it turns out, it was a remarkable bit of foresight when sagnosaurs, later subsumed under Therizinosauridae, were discovered in the late 70s and after. By the way, if you want to know more about ichnology, I highly recommend this book. Now believe me, a good book, just like a good model or statue, is one that gets you curious to find out more about a subject you may have no interest in. And this book is written really well, with so much humor that I read it straight and finished it in 4 days. Now, Sennikov has done a lot of work on Therizinosaurus locomotion, and for those interested in more depth, his work is a must-read, and I'll reference a couple of articles below. But briefly, here's the relevance to our dinosaur today. Macropodosaurus tracks show imprints of 4 long digits. Digits 2, 3, and 4 bore most of the weight, but the impression of digit 1 is also consistently seen, showing it took part not just in weight bearing, but also in push-off. The imprint is of the whole foot, suggesting the animal was walking. Now you'll see that if you run on the beach, mainly just the front part of your foot is impressed, while when you walk slowly, it's your whole foot. We also know it was walking slowly because the pace length was only 1.5 times its pes length. But there were no tail drag marks, indicating that the tail was lifted off, even while walking slowly. There were no handprints, which means that this was a biped. The tracks are deep and surrounded by wide expulsion rims, indicating very large size. The question is, what? Now, based on the trackway and the track morphology and its bipedality, Sennikov excluded ornithischians, sauropods, or digitigrade theropods. Prosauropods like Ankylosaurus seem to fit the bill, but these dinosaurs were unknown past the early Jurassic. Now, based on the general proportions of the pes and metatarsal region, sagnosaurs seem to fit best, and not just any sagnosaur, but given the size of Macropodosaurus, it could only be one of the largest ones, and Therizinosaurus fits the glass slipper most pleasingly. Now, why therizinosaurs were plantigrade is interesting, and the idea proposed by Sennikov is simply as an adaptation to keep them upright despite their ungainly proportions, their large bellies, and unwieldy large arms. For stability, the center of mass has to be above the contact area of the feet, and a high center of gravity tends to be more unstable. Now, these would normally conspire to bring the animal forward and eventually on all fours, because to stay balanced on 2 feet is harder as animals grow larger. In theropods, the arms are much smaller and the tail acts as a counterbalance. Animals like prosauropods and sauropods developed facultative and eventually obligate quadrupedality to deal with this. In therizinosaurs, becoming plantigrade increased the support area and effectively shortened the hind limb length, bringing the CG of the animal closer to the ground. Finally, we just have to talk about those claws. The unguals were up to 50 centimeters or 19.7 inches long, with added length with overlying keratin. Unfortunately, they were too fragile to do anything too dramatic with. As you can see, these aren't sword blades or spears that will impale anything, as we might hope. The flexor tubercle on the claw in Therizinosaurus is very weak. That's a tubercle you see more clearly here in the wedge-tailed eagle, or Deinonychus, and is an attachment point for the flexor digitorum profundus muscle, which is involved in gripping or rather forceful flexing. So it would have been very weak either for seizing prey or for actively clawing. I also mentioned in my PNSO 𝗨𝗨𝗃𝗧 review the study by 𝗨𝗨𝗃𝗍𝗃 et al. In 2014, which performed an FEA on different therizinosaur claws and tested the stress distribution in 3 conditions. These were scratch digging, hooking and pulling, and piercing. As you can see from the hotspot, scratch digging has the higher stresses, so that probably rules out using the claws like an anteater. The hook and pull is more likely. Even then, there are still stresses on the top of the claw. Finally, we also see that the more elongate the claw, the more stress experienced in all conditions. The authors conclude that hook and pull feeding is indeed more likely, but they also state that although defensive use isn't evidenced by their findings, they may still have well used them in an emergency. Alright, let's do some comparisons, and the first has to be the 𝗣𝗨𝗱𝗁𝗱𝗄𝗧 Therizinosaurus. As you can see in terms of color, the 𝗣𝗨𝗱𝗁𝗱𝗄𝗧 certainly is more striking at first glance, especially from afar. However, when you consider all the subtle shades and mixes in the PNSO, you'll quickly appreciate that the PNSO is by far superior. In fact, the sculpting is very good on both, but in terms of the feathers, the PNSO has a degree of fineness that's in a class of its own. And thankfully, the boundary between fur and skin doesn't have the hair shirt look that the 𝗣𝗨𝗱𝗁𝗱𝗄𝗧 has. Sadly, both of them are digitigrade. But more importantly for me, the PNSO has 4 weight-bearing toes, which is a unique feature of this dinosaur. And finally, I just really like the PNSO pose. There's nothing wrong with the 𝗣𝗨𝗱𝗁𝗱𝗄𝗧 one, but I've seen so many models and paintings of Therizinosaurus in this kind of arm-waving pose that I really welcome the more naturalistic, almost casual look of the PNSO. Now next we have to look at the other prehistoric weirdo from PNSO, the 𝗨𝗨𝗃𝗧𝗃𝗃. The same bipedal stance, the awkward look with that pot belly, a herbivorous lifestyle, and short tail. And of course, those claws. Now you can see that while the 𝗨𝗨𝗃𝗧𝗃𝗃 has a color scheme that's loudly pleasing, the Therizinosaurus has a more subdued, though equally high quality paint application. I feel they complement each other famously. And finally, just a look at that contemporaneous 𝗪𝗪saurus for those of you who might want to get a dramatic diorama going. I usually buy only the best models of a genus I can find from 1 or 2 companies, but when I started buying PNSO because each and every release has matched my most important selection criteria, I had a sneaking suspicion that most of PNSO would eventually furnish my personal favorite model of each dinosaur. That's certainly so for this PNSO Therizinosaurus. And this is definitely going to stand right beside the 𝗨𝗨𝗃𝗧𝗁𝗃𝗃 on the shelf. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you soon in the next video.